Hi, everybody, and welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden. I am the host of this program. Well, today is April 19th, and our good neighbors to the south in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, this is a holiday. It's Patriots Day. And I think the thing we know most about Patriots Day, the old tradition, the Boston Marathon, and of course the Red Sox playing the game in the morning. Well, the Red Sox are still on. And the last I heard, just before I came in the studio, and at the end of 6.5 innings, the Sox were up on the White Sox 10-4. So they should be able to hold on and win this one after blowing a couple of yesterday. As far as the Boston Marathon, thanks to the pandemic, there is no marathon this year. Originally, the Red Sox played their game in the morning, usually begin 11 o'clock. And the idea was that the game would come to an end just before the lead runners hit the finish line. And you know, the Boston Marathon is 26 miles. And the idea was that the people would get out of Fenway Park and go on and watch the wrap-up on the marathon. And of course, just a few years back, they had that tragedy down there when these two people from, let's see, they were from somewhere, I believe Serbia. And they set off those explosions where some people were killed and a couple of cases people lost limbs. Real tragedy. But that was not enough to cancel the Boston Marathon. What canceled the Boston Marathon, of course, was this pandemic. And we're seeing it in all of our public events. For example, you look at the baseball game now, you see more empty seats than you see people there. Each ballpark is limited to a certain number of people, and it comes nowhere near to filling the ballpark. But a few lucky ones that have tickets and can get in and watch the game in person, they've got all kinds of room there because they have to be separated, you know, the 6-foot separation rule and all the rest of it. So on this Patriots Day with no marathon, but still baseball, still a baseball game. As I say, the Red Sox, the last I knew, they were leading 10-4. Well, what does Patriots Day commemorate? Well, actually, it commemorates, in all possibility, the start of the fighting of the American Revolution. You know, the British, of course, British Redcoats, they were the mother country. We were the colonies over here. And we just finished a war, the French and Indian War, as it was called, in which the English were successful, drove the French out of North America, took over the province of Quebec and what had been French possessions through what is now Canada, and parts of the central United States around the Mississippi Valley. Well, to pay for this war, the Parliament in London levied a rather heavy tax on the colonies. And of course, this brought up a lot of resentment. The folks over here in the colonies felt that they had done more than their share to help the British win the war, and they resented being taxed. As Patrick Henry in the Virginia House of Burgess said, it's taxation without representation, which was a cause for revolt. And nowhere in the country was the spirit of revolution higher than probably in Massachusetts. Around Boston. We'd had the so-called Boston Massacre that had taken place shortly before, well, it's past the winter before the Patriots Day thing took place, more or less, in which some young Bostonians threw snowballs at the British troops. And the Redcoats turned and they fired on the guys throwing the snowballs, and one of them, a liberated slave from the south, named Crispus Attucks, he was killed, and he is regarded as the first casualty of the American Revolution. Well, the spirit of rebellion was very, very high in Boston. They had the Boston Tea Party, in which British merchant ships carrying tea to sell in the colonies were attacked by colonists dressed up as Native Americans, and the crates of tea, of course, were thrown into the harbor. And there were other acts of violence. And so there's an extra strong British military presence in Boston, because it's felt, there was a spirit of rebellion, and they wanted to quell that spirit. And word had come that the colonists had a large stash of ammunition and weapons in what is now Concord, Massachusetts, northwest of Boston. And the British planned to send an expedition up there to eliminate that Patriot arsenal. Well, the Patriots had set up a signal, and it would be in the Old North Church. They didn't know how the British were going to come. Were they going to come overland, or were they going to go up the coast and sort of come in a pincer movement? And they also had some riders set up. And when they saw what move or anticipated move the British military was going to make, then they would set out to alert the various, as they call themselves, Minutemen, to stand ready to thwart the British advance. And there were actually three riders. Went in one south, one north, the other directly west. And the one we know best, of course, is Paul Revere. Revere took off and went up what is now Route 2 out of Massachusetts, up through Lexington and Concord, and alerted the Minutemen that the British were coming. The Redcoats were marching up the road. And so the local farmers and the local militia got their old weapons, and they prepared to ambush the British troops. Well, we know about Paul Revere because Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a well-known poet, wrote a poem called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Paul Revere himself was a coppersmith working in Boston. And when they had an idea that the British were going to be moving up toward Concord to attack that Patriot arsenal in Concord, he took off on his horse, and he alerted we'll call them the Minutemen, if we will, that the British were coming. Take up arms, hide behind stone walls and all that, and prepare to harass the British troops in the hopes that they would turn back. Excuse me. Well, we know the first battle was at Lexington, and the British were victorious. They dispersed the farmers that were there that were firing on them and so forth. And you might say that was a small British victory. With that, they moved on to Concord, and that was their objective. But when they approached Concord, they ran into a stronger militia force. And these guys were firing on the troops from behind stone walls and everything else. The British troops, the Redcoats, had been used to fighting European style. And of course, European style at that time was where the two armies lined up opposite each other and they fired away. And the folks in the first line, I know if I were one, I wouldn't want to be in the first line. They were the ones that went down first, became the first casualties. And then you'd have the second line would step up and so forth. Over here, the colonists, at least in the manual of fair warfare, weren't fighting fairly. They weren't lining up opposite and firing. They were hiding behind stone walls and trees and everything else. And these British redcoats that had been trained in the European style of fighting were ambushed, and they were dealt a very decisive defeat. And rather than have his whole contingent wiped out, the commander of the British troops at that time was a man by the name of Major Pitcairn. And he sounded the retreat, and they hustled back to Boston. So this is what Patriots Day symbolizes. It's the anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord. Lexington goes to the Redcoats, Concord goes to the colonists. And also, shortly thereafter, the Continental Congress that was meeting in Philadelphia authorized a Virginian who was a land surveyor and had served as a colonel in the Virginia militia to be the overall commander of the Continental armies. And George Washington took command of what was then the ragtag, really, military organization. He assumed command in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And at that particular time, the Continental Army consisted mainly of militia from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Vermont at that time, of course, was about to become an independent nation, which they would a year later in 1777. So George Washington took command of the Continental Army under a tree in Cambridge, Mass., which is now the site of Harvard University. Well, what began as military skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, of course, would lead into a full-scale war. And while the war actually ended in 1781, as far as combat was concerned, with the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia, that actually the British never pulled out of some of our major cities here, like New York, for example, until 1783. So while the fighting and the combat and all lasted 6 years, the war officially lasted 8 years. And it ended with the Treaty of Paris, in which Great Britain, which at that time was the #1 military power in the world, they were the mistress of the seas, they had built a huge empire. The saying was, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because they had virtual colonies all over the world. But this one, they were not going to have that much longer. And with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, they recognized the independence of the 13 colonies over here. And well, it was a humiliating defeat, really, for Great Britain. Because the greatest military power on earth had been beaten by a group of, if you will, militia, local state militia, who are not really full-time. Most of them signed up for something like a 3-year commitment, and when their commitment was over, they went back to farming. But with the help of our French allies, we were successful. And of course came the task of putting together a nation. You had 13 colonies, and all of them were pretty independent. And there came the task of putting together a nation, which, as you know, our founding fathers were very successful at that. There's a lot of compromise, a lot of arguing, a lot of battling back and forth. And eventually they would pull the country together and put together a constitution with a lot of checks and balances. And of course, as you know, the Constitution begins with "We the people." We the people. Much of the anger against Parliament, primarily taxes, a lot of people over here resented the fact that George III, who was the British king at the time, and was said to be a little bit wacko, he was from a German family. A few years earlier, with no apparent heir to the British throne, Parliament invited the royal family from Hanover, Germany, to assume the throne. And the first two Georges, George I and George II, and maybe even George III, didn't speak English. They spoke German. And of course, as a result of this, during the American Revolution, many of the troops that came over here and served under British generals were Hessians, German troops. One of the things at the Battle of Bennington, which was actually fought in Hoosick Falls, New York, but after the defeat, the troops that came down to fight the Battle of Bennington on the British side were all Hessian. And the general in command of the Hessian troops didn't speak English. Of course, he was wounded, and he was captured and taken back to Bennington, and he's trying to communicate with his captors, and they didn't know what he was saying, and he didn't know what they were saying. Well, he understood a little English. He had to serve under General Burgoyne. But the militia people who had captured him didn't understand what he was saying. He is buried at a museum, or what is now a museum, in what they call Old Bennington. It's a small section west of downtown Bennington on Route 9. And he is buried there along with a number of other Hessian troops. If you took a tour of the Hubbard battlefield, most of the soldiers that were killed there and that are buried there were Hessians. Most of the Americans that were killed in that battle, the American troops took with them as many as they could. There are a few that are buried at Hubbard, but as many as they could when they retreated and headed east, retreating over to Route 7 before what was left of them, marched south to join the American forces in Bennington. They took their wounded and their dead, as many as they could, with them. So that's the reason why the number of American dead that are buried in Hubbard is smaller than the number of Hessian troops that were buried over there. Well, once the British had been defeated at Concord, retreated back into Boston, the next strategy was, how do you bottle them up? Well, the American Army needed cannon. And Fort Ticonderoga, which had been a French fort to begin with, and it was captured by the British, and it was finally captured by Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. The cannon was turned over to the American military. And I believe there was something like 8 cannon taken out of Fort Ty and hauled down to Boston and set up on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill and the surrounding area. A few years back, I think it was, probably in 1976, the late Tom Egan, who was an insurance agent in Rutland, he was also very, very active in reliving American history. He created a thing called the hypotenuse to history, in which a model cannon was hauled by different classes of high school students, and it went in a reverse direction back to Fort Ty. And I was teaching history at Polteny at the time, and my class came over, and we picked up the cannon in Cuttingsville, and we hauled it up as far as Pierce's Corners, which time Mill River took over. And they were joined by Rutland. Eventually, of course, the cannon wound up in Shoreham, and it was ferried across Lake Champlain, and today I believe that cannon is still at Fort Ty. But it was sort of a history lesson, got students involved. It was hauling a cannon in the reverse direction, of course, which never happened in actuality. But it was a good example of trying to inspire your students to take a little more of interest in American history. You know, here in our country, and you go way back to the beginning of colonization, we have a history that is both glorious and tragic. And we more or less are living out both sides of that right now. I think we have become more and more aware of some of our errors. We always talked about the glory of our history. But I think we're also looking at some of the more sour points of our history. And of course, the big one, of course, was slavery. And the way it would work, there would be tribal wars in Africa. And the winning tribe would take their captives, and they would sell their captives to slave traders who would load them on these ships, sometimes whole families, and transport them to the New World, where they were needed to work on the various plantations and farms, especially in the South, where cotton was a big crop. And it was back-breaking work, picking cotton and all that sort of thing. Excuse me. And not many of the wealthy white plantation owners wanted to do that, nor did some of the people who were a little bit poorer, because they regarded that as slave work. So in order to keep these plantations running, they needed laborers. And that's what caused the slave trade to boom. And there are many other tragedies, the way the Native Americans were treated. Going back to the Pilgrims, Plymouth, Massachusetts, second Thanksgiving, when the chief that had befriended them when they first landed, they captured him and beheaded him. And we've seen, the way our Native Americans were treated. Something that is not far from being glorious in our history. The drawback on slavery. The Trail of Tears, which Andrew Jackson, who was president of the United States at the time, and he signed a law and pushed a law through Congress called the Indian Removal Act, which the Cherokee nations, which populated much of North and South Carolina and parts of Georgia and Tennessee, were marched from their homelands and into what was regarded at that time as wild territory. It's now the state of Oklahoma. And these people, many of them died from the hardship. The military herded them in there, drove them into Oklahoma. Certainly a drawback on our history. And the way we treated the Native Americans out in the West, they were always the bandits, always the bad guys. We did not really take into consideration that what they were fighting for were their homeland. They were trying to preserve their homeland and their ways, and they weren't into accepting the ways of the European settlers. But of course, over time, the Europeans came over here and grew, and the country expanded, and so forth. So we look back on our history and look back at the celebration of this day, and you kind of wonder, what if the British had won at Concord? They'd captured that cache of arms and guns and so forth that the Patriots had stashed there. How would our history have gone? But we look at that as really the start of the Revolution. The beginning of the American Revolution, most of the battles were fought up in the northern part of the colonies, and then later on they shifted into the South. And everything, of course, as we know, did not go smooth for the Continental Army or for George Washington. I'm sure there were times when he questioned why he'd ever accepted the command. An army that was sometimes rebellious. Some of his own generals felt that he wasn't competent. There was jealousy. Many of the generals that were serving in the Continental Army felt that they should be the commander-in-chief, not George Washington. Then you had Valley Forge, bitter, bitter cold winter. When he had to hold his army together, there were a number of deserters. They said, no, I'm not going to, for me the war is over, let somebody else fight it. It's very, very, very interesting the way this country has developed. We've had our high points, we've had our low points, and we're seeing that to this day. One of the low points in our history was what happened on January 6th. The invasion of the Capitol, the attempt to thwart the constitutional process of certifying the election of a President of the United States. And this insurrection, of course, was encouraged and inspired, motivated by a president who had been defeated, whom the public had said, we've had enough of you, we want to change. And that was something he couldn't handle. And somewhere down the line, eventually he's going to be charged with treason, because it was a treasonous act to encourage a bunch of, let's say a bunch of stupid people to try to overthrow a constitutional process, something that we have been proud of over the years, the way we've been able to have a transition of power without having to do it with a military coup. And yet this more or less was an attempt by the defeated president to keep his successor from taking office. And certainly a blot, in a way a blot on our history, but in another way it showed the fact that the certification of the 46th President of the United States took place. It showed that democracy prevailed and that the Constitution was still the law of the land. And that Constitution, of course, has been challenged. It was challenged in the Civil War, the war between the states. And it was challenged again on January 6th. And I'm sure in the future there are going to be other challenges in the years ahead as people make changes. So on this day, we join with our good neighbors to the south in the state of Massachusetts. They have good weather for their holiday. And it's unfortunate that one of the highlights of Patriots Day had to be canceled, but a lot of things are being canceled today. Things are different with this pandemic 19, COVID-19. We're going to have to accept a new way of life, a new way of doing things. The old ways just aren't going to work anymore. And the country is adjusting. We now have leadership in Washington that is real leadership in the Biden administration. I know some of our Republican friends are unable to accept the fact that the Trump administration is history, thank the Lord for that. And they are looking at the Biden administration and they're wondering, why he can't move faster. Well, I think so far he's done a pretty good job. It's going to take a while to undo the damage of the previous administration. He's doing that bit by bit. But I think eventually we'll get on track. Will we ever be able to conquer this virus which is going around? Somewhere down the road, we're going to get it under control. But that's for the future to decide. With that, happy Patriots Day. May Almighty God bless the United States of America, and we'll see you all next week.